The sugya that we are going to discuss in Siman Kufpei Dalad is the discussions of where to recite Birkas Hamazon when one is finished eating. And although this discussion may apply to all of the after brachas, we're going to take it at this point as only dealing with Birkas Hamazon, with benching. And after we have fleshed out the principles, then we will explore in the coming Seifim whether the same applies to other foods. So the theme for Kufpei Dalad is that after one has eaten and one needs to recite Birkas Hamazon, where one has to recite it and under what conditions one has to recite Birkas Hamazon at the table that one ate. We begin with a Mishnah in Brachos on Daf Nun Aleph Amud Beis. The Mishnah cites various disputes between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel over instances of meals, halachas involving eating. And in the course of the Mishnah, the following is stated. Misha Achal, someone who has finished eating, and he gets up from the table, v'shachach v'lo beirach, and he forgot to bench. He gets up from the table, he either thinks that he's benched already, and he walks away, or he gets distracted, and he gets into some other activity, and then he realizes that he hasn't benched yet. Beis Shammai hold that he must go back to the place that he ate, and he must bench over there, and Beis Hillel hold that he is allowed to bench where he remembers. Okay. So that is the beginning of this discussion, and that is the one line in the Mishnah that begins it all. The Gemara on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Beis stretches this Mishnah out a little bit further. At first, we have Rav Zvid. Rav Zvid adds to the Mishnah by saying that the machloikas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel was only over a case of someone who forgot to bench when they left the table. However, if they purposely left the table knowing that they still had to bench and had in mind they were going to bench somewhere else, they did not want to bench where they ate, that is called b'mezid, that is intentional. And over here, Beis Hillel will agree with Beis Shammai that he has to return to the place that he ate and bench over there. So the Gemara questions, but isn't that obvious? The Mishnah stated the case that where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel dispute is shachach, specifically someone who forgot to bench. From the Mishnah itself, we can derive that if the person was not shachach, if he was brazen about it, then he would have to return, even according to Beis Hillel. And the Gemara answers that, in fact, you may have thought Beis Hillel never held that you have to return to the table to bench anyway. Under all circumstances, and the Mishnah just used the case of shachach, of forgetting to bench, to tell us the extent of how Beis Shammai is prepared to go in requiring him back to return back to the table. So therefore, Rav Zvid had to tell us that there is a point where Beis Hillel agree with Beis Shammai, namely in the case of Mezid, in the case where he brazenly left the table without benching. So that's the first part of the sugya in the Gemara. The Gemara then brings a brisa, which continues the dispute in the Mishnah between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel over somebody who forgot to bench and remembered, where Beis Shammai hold they have to return, Beis Hillel hold they don't have to return. Beis Hillel argue the logic that the reason that the person should not have to return is that it seems undue pressure on him. For consider the case of somebody who ate his meal on the top floor and then remembered by the time he got to the bottom floor of the building that he hadn't benched yet. Do we expect him to go back up to the top floor and bench over there? Can't he bench at the bottom? And to that, Beis Shammai retort that this line of logic is flawed, because if a person left his wallet on the top floor and he remembered when he had reached the bottom, for sure he would climb to the top to go and fetch his wallet. So if a person is prepared to go the mile for his own needs, then why shouldn't we expect him to go the needs for Shamayim, for Kavod Shamayim, to go and bench at the table that he ate and give due honor to the one who he is blessing, who has provided him the food? And that is the end of the brisa, where Beis Shammai have repudiated their stance that a person needs to return back to where he ate, even if it is an inconvenience. The Gemara then brings various incidents of Amoraim, other Chachamim, who held or did not hold, like Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. But what interests us is the last episode that the Gemara brings regarding Rabba Bar Bachana. Rabba Bar Bachana was traveling with a caravan, and the company stopped along the way to eat, and then the company continued their journey, and sometime after that point, Rabba Bar Bachana realized that he hadn't benched yet, and he wanted to return back to the spot where he had eaten. However, to get the caravan to stop and wait for him would have been a difficult exercise. So therefore, Rabba Bar Bachana came up with an idea, and he told the members of the company that he'd forgotten a precious item at the place that they'd stopped to eat, and he needed to go back and retrieve it. And the company agreed, whether they followed him back or whether they waited for him. It seems like they waited for him. Rabba Bar Bachana was able to return back to the spot where he ate and bench, and then he was rewarded by finding a precious item, a golden dove, which he brought back to the company to show. All right, so that is the end of the sugya in the Gemara, and these are the bits from the shas itself that we have to work with. Now, in formulating the halacha, we have a general rule that whenever there's a machloikis between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the halacha follows Beis Hillel. And indeed, the same would apply here, that Beis Hillel would require only someone who is bemazed, who intentionally left the table without benching, to return back to his table and bench there. Otherwise, if he forgot when he left the table, it was just a shogeg, a case of mistake, then Beis Hillel would allow him to bench wherever he remembers. And not only that, but the Gemara here in Brachos on Daf Nun Beis, Amud Beis, actually spells it out and says that the halacha follows Beis Hillel for all of the cases enumerated in the Mishnah, except for one case, and our case is not that case. And so the Gemara itself spells out that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, and that one is only expected to return back to the place one ate if one left the table bemazed. And indeed, this is how the Rambam paskins, like Beis Hillel. So it would seem an open shut case, and it would seem there's nothing more to talk about. However, there are a group of disputing Rishonim. We begin with Rav Amram Goin, who paskins like Beis Shammai. And Rav Amram's opinion is brought in several places within the Tosfos. Over here, in our Masechta, we have the one on Daf Nun Beis Amud Beis, Dibur Amaskil Bekule. We have a Tosfos in Sukkah as well, where Rav Amram Goin lists all of the places that we follow Beis Shammai, not only Rav Amram Goin, but the Rosh as well, over here, paskins like Beis Shammai. So whatever one's intentions are, when one leaves the table, one has to return to bench. We also find other Rishonim like Rabbeinu Yoda, who paskin like Beis Shammai. It appears that there's quite a corpus of Rishonim that paskin like Beis Shammai. And then we come to the Tur. The Tur not only paskins like Beis Shammai, but he adds something that hasn't been addressed up to this point. The Tur holds that if a person leaves the table forgetting to bench and he remembers afterwards, then he has to return to his table and he needs to recite Birkas HaMazon there, where he ate. If a person leaves the table knowing he hasn't benched, then he has to also return to the table and bench there. But not only that, if he did not return to the table, if he refuses to return to the table, and instead benches in the location of his desire, then he's not even yotze the mitzvah Birkas HaMazon. He hasn't fulfilled his obligation to even recite Birkas HaMazon, and he needs to go back to the table and bench again, a second time. So the Tur takes it a step further. Now, before we continue, let's just pause and reflect a moment on the Tur. The Noisei Kalim are bothered where it is that the Tur derives his exceptionally extreme chumrah from, that a person's not even yotzi benching if he benched in another location. The Beis Yosef there on the Tur explains that the Tur interpreted Beis Shammai's case of b'mezid as being more strict than Beis Hillel's case of b'mezid, meaning to say that it's not that Beis Hillel agree with Beis Shammai only in a case of b'mezid, that if a person leaves knowing he hasn't benched, that he has to return to the table, but Beis Shammai see a case of mezid is as even more severe than Beis Hillel. So while Beis Hillel agree with Beis Shammai on b'mezid, Beis Shammai don't agree with Beis Hillel on mezid. Beis Shammai up the ante when it comes to mezid, and they hold that not only do you have to return to the table, but if you don't, you're not even yotze the mitzvah of benching. So that's the way the Beis Yosef understood the Tur, that the Tur interpreted Beis Shammai as being more strict than Beis Hillel on both levels. What Beis Hillel would consider adequate treatment for a shoygeg, Beis Hillel would consider adequate treatment for a mezid. But what Beis Hillel would consider what Beis Shammai would consider adequate treatment for a mezid is even more severe, that they should not be yotze the mitzvah either. So that's the way that the Beis Yosef explains the Tur. The Taz, however, has a problem with this because we don't find a source anywhere in the Gomorrah or in the Rishonim to indicate that Beis Shammai would be more strict than Beis Hillel in a case of mezid. We know that Beis Hillel would concur with Beis Shammai when it comes to someone who leaves the table knowingly, but we don't find in any indication that Beis Shammai would take it up a notch and that you're not even yotze the mitzvah. Not only that, but who's to say that Beis Shammai would treat mezid any more severe than Beis Hillel would treat mezid? Maybe it's just a kol shekain. Like the Gemara says, Beis Shammai were prepared to go as far as to hold that even a shoygeg needs to return back to the table, which shows that when it comes to mezid, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree on the base principle that the man needs to go back to bench where he ate. But when it comes to shoygeg, that is where Beis Shammai take it up a notch, not the reverse. So the Taz has an issue with the Beis Yosef, and therefore the Taz finds the explanation for the Tur in that Gemara with the episode of Rabba Baba Chana. That's why we quoted it. This is where it becomes instructive. Rabba Baba Chana forgot to bench. And when the caravan had already covered more ground, he realized that he needed to bench. So at that point, Rabba Baba Chana had to weigh up whether it was possible to return back to where he ate or not. Because if it was still possible for him to return, and he refused to return, then he would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon. So therefore he had to come up with this grand scheme to try and convince the caravan to wait for him. And it was an experiment, because if they wouldn't have waited for him, then he would realize that he was not able to return back to where he ate. But if he could return, then he would be obligated to return. Otherwise, he would not be able to fulfill the mitzvah of benching at all. And that would have been the only cause for him to go to all of this effort. And therefore, we see that Rabba Baba Chana not only held like Beis Shammai, but that once one is amazed, as soon as one neglects to go back to where one ate, and one does so willfully in any form, whether one refuses to return back to the table, or whether one left the table and still refuses to return back to the table, then one would not fulfill the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon at all. And that is the basis behind the Tur saying that if one is amazed in any form, then one would have to return back to the table and even bench a second time if one failed to bench there for the first time. All right, so that is the Taz explaining the Tur. And coming back now to the progression. So we have a machloikas. On the one hand, we have the Rambam, who paskins like Beis Hillel. We have a whole list of Rishonim who paskin like Beis Shammai. And therefore, when it comes to the halacha, we find the following. The Mechaber in Sif Aleph, right, when it comes to the case of mazid, if someone leaves the table knowing they haven't benched, then according to everybody, they have to return back to the table. That's a known. According to the Mechaber, if a person doesn't return to the table and benches where they are, then they are yotzi the mitzvah of Birkas Hamazon, and they don't have to bench again. However, where the Mechaber is not decided is in a case of shoygeg. If a person leaves without benching and realizes afterwards that he hasn't benched, whether he has to return, there the Mechaber brings the two sides, but he does not reconcile. The Ramah, on the other hand, does hold like Beis Shammai, that you do have to return back to the table, even in a case of shoygeg. And the Ramah seems to hold like the Tur as well, that if you were mazid, if you left and you knew you had to bench and you still refused and benched where you are, then you're not even yotzi the mitzvah of benching. However, the Taz does not hold as far as the Tur in this aspect. He agrees that in a case of shoygeg you have to return back to the table, but in a case of mazid, if you benched, instead of returning to the table knowing that you needed to return, even if you left the table knowing that you hadn't benched yet, and then you recited Birkas Hamazon, you have fulfilled the mitzvah b'diavad, you don't have to return back to the table. That much the Taz holds of. So now when it comes to formulating the halacha, just to simplify things at this point in the discussion, we basically have four different areas. First, the lechatchila sheb'lechatchila. Second, the lechatchila sheb'b'diavad. The third is the b'diavad sheb'b'diavad. And the fourth is shas adchak. So the first, the lechatchila sheb'lechatchila. The best is that one should bench where one ate, without getting up and if one can, one should return back to the table, even b'shoigeg, according to everybody. That's the best of the best. Give honor to the mitzvah by benching where one ate. Second is the b'diavad. If one did get up from the table by mistake, now what should one do lechatchila? That's a machloikas, and the overwhelming majority of Rishonim and Poskim hold like Beis Shammai that one should return back to the table and bench. And for sure, if one was bemazed, if one got up thinking that one could bench somewhere else, wanting to bench somewhere else, one would have to return back to the table. The third area is the b'diavad sheb'b'diavad. If one left the table and one benched elsewhere, whether b'shogeg or b'mazid, then according to the Taz, according to the Alter Rebbe, according to the Mishnah Berurah, Sofek brachos lahakil, one does not have to bench again. One has fulfilled the mitzvah of birkas hamazon. One needn't bench again. And then we have the fourth area, which is shas hadchak, meaning if one left the table and one actually left the location that one ate and one's quite far away from that location, or one realizes that one hasn't benched when it's too late to return back to one's original location, whether one is either under time pressure or financial pressure, or circumstances are such that one cannot return back to one's original place where one ate and one feels compelled to bench where one is, then the Ra'avan holds that one is allowed to bench where one remembers. Now, the Taz adds to the Ravan and holds that even b'mazid, even in a case of where one left the table knowing one hadn't benched, and one finds oneself in a situation that it becomes impossible to return, then one is allowed to bench where one remembers as well. However, the other Achronim disagree with the Taz on this. The Alter Rebbe, the Mishnah Berurah, all maintain that if one leaves the table b'mazid, then one is in a terrible predicament, because even where it becomes impossible to return to one's location where one ate, one has to make the effort to do so, and one could be stuck. So that's a situation that one needs to avoid. This is the basic outline of our sugya from the Gemara through to the Achronim, and this ends part one of our discussion. We will now begin part two, which will be to analyze the entire sugya. Part two, the analysis. We need to understand the basis of this machloikas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and why are Beis Shammai so strict when it comes to someone who made a mistake, genuinely forgot to bench, that they have to return back to the table where they ate. In addition to that, we have 10 questions on this entire sugya from the Gemara all the way through to the halacha. Question number 1, the Loshen of the Mishnah. The way the Mishnah presents the case is with the phrase shachach v'lo beirach, he forgot and he did not make a bracha. Because the Mishnah always chooses the most concise and grammatically appropriate words, why didn't the Mishnah rather word itself saying shachach levarech or shachach milevarech, if a person forgot to make the bracha? Why word it in this way, shachach, he forgot, and then v'lo beirach, he did not bench? That's question number 1. Question number 2, on Beis Hillel. Beis Hillel holds that only if a person leaves b'mazid, if he leaves without benching, knowing that he hasn't benched, then he has to return to the table. So the question is, mima nafshach, either way. If Beis Hillel hold that the location is indispensable for the mitzvah, in order to fulfill the mitzvah birkas hamazon, then one should have to return to the place one ate, no matter what one's intentions were. But if the place that one benches is irrelevant and does not inhibit the fulfillment of the mitzvah, then why should he have to return to the table when it's b'mazid? So understandably, according to Beis Shammai, we can see that the location of the where one recites Birkas Hamazon seems to be a t'nai in the mitzvah, that it is indispensable in some way to the fulfillment of the mitzvah itself. But according to Beis Hillel, why should there be a difference between shogeg and mazid? That's question number 2. Question number 3. The argument that Beis Shammai made of if one is prepared to go to the lengths in order to retrieve one's own money and fulfill see to one's own needs, all the more so for the sake of Shamayim, Beis Hillel did not respond to that argument, and it seems like a very cogent argument. So why didn't Beis Hillel respond? Is it because they retracted to hold like Beis Shammai? Or is something missing? Or is there a misunderstanding? Why didn't Beis Hillel respond to that argument? That's question number 3. Question number 4. Also the phrasing that Beis Shammai use. They say that if a person is prepared to go up to the top floor to get his money, lichvoid atzmoi, for his own honor. Why didn't they use the phrase letzorech atzmoi? If a person is prepared to see to his own needs, then all the more so the needs of Shamayim. Where is their kavod? What aspect of honor and dignity is there in walking up the few flights of steps to get one's money? So the choice of words needs clarification. Question number 5. On Beis Shammai's kal vachomer, that if a person is prepared to go to lengths to retrieve his money, all the more so to give honor to Shamayim, seemingly the kal vachomer is flawed, because a person has to walk up to the top to get his money if he ever wants to get his money back. That's the only way of being able to get his wallet. However, it is possible for him to bench where he is without having to go back upstairs to the table. He can still fulfill the mitzvah at any point that he finds himself. He can bless Hashem wherever he is. So what type of kal vachomer is this, where it is necessary to go up to the top floor for his wallet, but it's not necessary? One can bench downstairs as well, just as easily. Sifsei Chachamim on the sugya over here also has a query on the kal vachomer that maybe he's expected al pi Torah to go up to the top floor to get his money in order not to destroy property unlawfully. It's an interesting question. We'll address that question as well if you want to see it inside. I'm not going to get into it. All right, that was question number 5. Question number 6. The obvious question now, moving to the Rishonim, is if we have an established rule that the halacha follows Beis Hillel, and especially a specific mention in the Gemara itself that the halacha follows Beis Hillel, how can Rav Amram Goyen and most of the Rishonim ignore that and favor Beis Shammai? The Tosfos in Brachos addresses this question and says that where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel have some common grounds where they agree, then the halacha does not need to follow Beis Hillel. So over here, where there's the case of mazid, where Beis Hillel agree with Beis Shammai in principle that you should return back to the table, and they agree with Beis Shammai that when a person leaves the table b'mazid, that he has to return back to the table to bench. Since there is this common ground, and since there is a principle upon which Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree, so that wasn't what the Gemara was referring to when it said in all this chapter the halacha follows Beis Hillel. We need to understand this answer. We need to understand Tosfos' explanation, because it still seems difficult. Indeed, when it comes to the case of Mazid, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel may agree on what the halacha should be, but when it comes to Shoigeg, that is where they disagree. And it is regarding that point where they disagree that the Gemara has said the halacha should follow Beis Hillel, not where they agree on Mazid. In a case of Shoigeg, that's where the Gemara sides with Beis Hillel. So really, the machloikus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel over someone who leaves the table forgetting to bench should end up with the halacha following Beis Hillel. General rule and specific citation in the Gemara. So we need to understand Tosfos' answer. What type of answer is it? How does that address the Rishonim ignoring what the Gemara has flagrantly or has stipulated openly? Question number 7. Moving on to the Tur, who holds that not only do you have to return b'shoigeg, but b'mezid, if you didn't return to the table and you benched, you're not even yoytze the mitzvah. We need to understand the mechanism. How is the location and the intention of the person to bench in another location able to affect the mitzvah itself? And on a more technical level, the mitzvah to bench is midoraisa. The Torah says, eat, be satisfied, bless, and the Torah doesn't give any specifics where the location should be. The Torah does not indicate that the location of where one makes the bracha should inhibit the mitzvah. It seems that it is midrabanan. At most, it is the chachamim that required one to bench where one ate and insist that one have to return to where one ate. Hence, this whole machloikus, Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel. There's no psukim that have been brought in over here. So, according to the Tur, how is it that the location and the specific intention for a person to bench somewhere else inhibits the fulfillment of the mitzvah itself, when the mitzvah stands on its own merit? As soon as one is benched, one has fulfilled the criteria of the pasuk, one is dispensed with it. So that's question number 7. We need to understand, according to the Tur, how does the location, and not only the location, but the intention of the person who chooses to bench in another location should actually undermine the mitzvah doraisa, which stands on its own. Question number 8 is understanding the Beis Yosef and the Taz and their explanation of where the Tur saw Beis Shammai as being that extreme to hold that if you made a bracha, if you benched elsewhere, b'mezid, that you're not even fulfilling the mitzvah. The Taz had his issues with the Beis Yosef that we need to resolve, and furthermore, there seems to be a difficulty with the Taz's proof from the episode of Rabba Baba Chana, because it could very well be that Rabba Baba Chana went to lengths in order to fulfill the words of Beis Shammai, or because he was going lifnim mishur asadin, he was going the extra mile in order to fulfill the words of Beis Shammai, and that's precisely why the Gemara brought this incident. The Gemara brings these sorts of incidents to show the extent towards the Chachamim were prepared to go in order to drive a point home, and that could be what the Gemara was doing here. That Rabba Baba Chana held like Beis Shammai, and these were the lengths that he went to fulfill the words of Beis Shammai, especially in contradistinction to the episode that was brought before then in the Gemara about the Talmud who flagrantly disregarded Beis Shammai and was punished. So there's no indication that Rabba Baba Chana felt compelled to go back to the location that he ate in order to fulfill the mitzvah, and had he not managed to go back, then he wouldn't have fulfilled the mitzvah, but rather because Rabba Baba Chana just wanted to go the extra mile and hold like Beis Shammai. Where is there again any indication from the Gemara that benching in another location, b'mezid, would inhibit the fulfillment of this mitzvah? The Pri Megadim has a bit of an explanation of the Taz over there, but it's a little bit difficult to try and get one's head around, because he speaks about leaving the table b'shogeg and then refusing to go back to the table b'mezid. There are a few chilukim, which is the style in the style of the Pri Megadim. It's a little bit difficult to wrap one's head around, but just the general understanding of the Taz is that the proof from Rabba Baba Chana was the fact that he made the effort to go back. And now we question, where is that indicating that he made that effort specifically because he would not have been able to fulfill the mitzvah, birkas hamazon at all? Question number 9. The Mechaber. The Mechaber is undecided whether the halacha should follow Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel. And the question is why? Why out of all areas in halacha is the Mechaber undecided when it should be a clear-cut case of whether Mechaber follows either the majority Rishonim, or he chooses the Rambam over others, or he has worked out through deduction in Beis Yosef who the halacha should follow? Why is the Mechaber undecided whether in a case of shogeg you should have to return to bench or not? And then question number 10, the last question, is that we mentioned right at the end the Ravan, and all those who hold like the Ravan, that in a case of necessity, where it's impossible to return to one's location, then one can bench where one is situated. One's exempt from having to go to the impractical and impossible task of going back to one's place of where one ate. We need to understand what constitutes shas adchak. How would we define a situation where a person cannot return back to where they ate? Surely where there's a will, there's a way, just like Rabba Baba Chana. And understandably, there are objective cases that if one ate bread in the airport and one remembers when one is mid-flight, right, that situation is not in one's control, understandably. But other than the unique cases like that, where would we be able to draw the line between an imposition, like walking from the bottom floor back up to the top floor, which is required al pi halacha, and shas adchak, where one would not be required to trek back to the location that one ate? We need to define that. So those are the 10 questions that we are going to address in our analysis. All right, let's get into an explanation. The Torah commands us, v'achalta v'savata uveirachta. You will eat, you will be satisfied, and only then will you bench, will you bless Hashem. Now, v'savata, being satisfied, and being satisfied as a criterion that requires blessing Hashem afterwards, can be explained in 2 ways. The first way is that being satisfied after eating is not only when one's stomach is full and when one doesn't want to eat anymore, when one feels one can't eat anymore. It's not only the physical sensation of being full and not wanting any more food, but there is a moment as well where when one feels full, one feels mentally satisfied as well. That what happens is whenever one feels needy of anything, the mind becomes preoccupied. There is a general feeling of uneasiness that a person has when they're hungry, tired, thirsty, depressed, stressed, anxious. And there is this sort of low-lying anxiety that the body has to want to eat, to survive. And so when a person has eaten their full, then they have this moment of mental relaxation and mental stability as well, where they now feel satisfied in their mind and emotionally. And this is the point that one really feels satisfied when one becomes aware and cognizant of the fact that one doesn't have to eat anymore, and that is a feeling of relief and also a feeling of a sensation which is a benefit, a joy in and of its own. Some people, just to give an illustration of this, that when a person feels full and they're sitting at the table, they may fold their hands and sit back and let out an exclamation to the point of "that was a wonderful meal," or that was great," or "gegessen satt," that was geschmack, that was wonderful, or let out a sigh, or give a thank you. There are these ways that a person acknowledges to themselves and others that one has finished eating and that one has really enjoyed the sensation. And that is the level of satisfaction that the Torah is talking about, that you will eat, you will be satisfied, not only physically, but mentally, emotionally, and aware of that satisfaction. And then, one must acknowledge the one who brought about this state, this mental state, this state of relief, and one must bless him, the Eibishter. So that's the first way of understanding Vasavata. The second way of understanding Vasavata, being satisfied, is the physical sensation of being full. That one now has the energy, one now has the ability to function, and it is just the physical sensation of not wanting to eat more that the Torah is addressing. So v'achalta, you will eat, v'savata, to the point that you no longer want to eat, and then you're in a position to function normally. Uverachta, you must acknowledge the Ribono Shel Olam at that point, for giving one koyach lasos chayil, the strength to be able to now function and go about one's daily activities. Now, the nafkamina between these two ways of understanding satisfaction is that according to the first way, being satisfied is a temporary emotion, a temporary state of mind that one feels only moments just after finishing one's meal and acknowledging one's state of mind at the time. But as soon as one gets up from the table and starts getting into other activities, then that sensation of being satisfied is forgotten. One's concentration then shifts into other areas of one's life, and one no longer has the same feeling of satisfaction. Even if one comes back to the table and one sits down, one's not going to have that same realization. That type of feeling is not the same anymore. Whereas according to the second understanding of satisfaction as being only physical and physiological, that sensation is going to last until about 72 minutes, man ikul, the amount of time it takes to digest one's food, and one will really feel full until the next point one feels hungry again. So there is a much longer window of satisfaction. So that's one nafkamina, and a major nafkamina, because according to the first way, one would have to bench at the moment that one feels mentally satisfied as well. And if one forgot to bench at that time, if one did not bench at that time, then one has not been able to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa, because one is no longer in a state of savata, of mental satisfaction in its full intensity. So if one returns back to the table after getting occupied in something else, then one is still obligated to bench. But that may be only midrabanan. The mitzvah d'oraisa has been lost because there's no vasavata anymore. There's no mental satisfaction. That feeling has dissipated. And it's very similar to if one has to bench after 72 minutes, where the physical sensation has also disappeared. So there is a window of how long one has to bench. But according to the first way of understanding vasavata, it's not only a time matter, but it's also a location and a state of mind that one has to be in order to fulfill the mitzvah in its entirety. Now, interestingly enough, the Tosfos, right at the end of the first parak, actually give a like a notarikon. They create a what you call it, a pleonasm out of this word v'savata, and they divide up the word as v'shev ata, that you need to bench while you are still seated. And they see seated, being seated in the word v'savata as being satisfied. So sitting at the table, enjoying the sensation of being full, is the feeling of satisfaction that the Torah is talking about according to this way of understanding it. And that is evident in the Tosfos, the way that they've interpreted this word on a homiletical level. But it does match the literal understanding of the word v'savata as well. So they do dovetail very nicely. So that's according to the first way of understanding v'savata, that one can actually lose the mitzvah d'oraisa. However, according to the second way of understanding v'savata, that the Torah requires us to bench only when we are experiencing a physical sensation of fullness, of not being hungry anymore, then one can fulfill that mitzvah of benching at any point and at any time and in any location, as long as one isn't hungry again, as long as the sensation of fullness is still lingering in the body from the meal. And this is the basis of the machlokas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai holds, like the first way, that v'savata means not only the physical sensation of being full, but also the awareness of being full and the mental and emotional sensation that comes at that point in the meal, the relief and the enjoyment at that point in the meal, that one has to acknowledge and one has to make a brocha over. And if one had to get up from the table without benching, then one has lost the mitzvah d'oraisa. One is no longer going to be in that state of mental satisfaction. That moment was fleeting and one has lost that moment. When one returns back to the table, then one at most is only going to be able to fulfill the mitzvah midrabanan. So in order to safeguard that people should bench before they get up from the table and be able to fulfill the mitzvah properly, midoraisa, Beis Shammai or Shammai Hazaken or someone prior to that, wherever that may have come from, Beis Shammai enacted a gzeira. Beis Shammai enacted that a person always has to return to the table to bench, whether they are b'shogeg, whether or b'mezid, no matter what their intentions are, because Beis Shammai wanted to safeguard the practice of benching where one ate, just after one ate, in order to train people to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. Otherwise, if people got the impression that there are times when they can bench away from the table, then that mistaken impression is going to lead to the dereliction of fulfilling the mitzvah d'oraisa itself. So therefore, Beis Shammai held, whether b'shogeg or b'mezid, a person is duty-bound to return to the table, and hopefully that will etch into the minds of people the importance of benching at the table, and that will lead to the fulfillment, whether people are aware of it or not, of the fulfillment of the mitzvah of Birkas HaMazon itself. However, Beis Hillel held, like the second way, that satisfaction means physical satisfaction, and one can really fulfill the mitzvah Birkas HaMazon anywhere. And so there was no need to enact any specific zera. However, Beis Hillel held that for the honor of the mitzvah, one should perform that mitzvah before moving on to one's other activities. Because benching is one of those things which can very easily fall by the wayside. As soon as one finishes one's meal, and one becomes distracted, one has to attend to something, or if one's eating a rushed meal, or if there's an emergency, it's very easy to forget to bench. And not only that, but when one has eaten to one's full and one is now obligated to bench, then when the mitzvah arrives, one should take the opportunity to perform that mitzvah immediately. One should not delay it, and one should not prioritize anything else over that mitzvah. So, lichvod shamayim, for the sake of the mitzvah, and to give the mitzvah its due dignity, to esteem the mitzvah, Beis Hillel holds that one should make birkas hamazon at the table before one gets up. And therefore, if a person disregards the need to honor the mitzvah, then the Beis Hillel, or Hillel HaZaken, or before then, whoever it may have originated with, Beis Hillel imposed a knas. Beis Hillel imposed a behavioral penalty on someone who flagrantly disregards the mitzvah and the need to respect the mitzvah, that such a person needs to return back to the table and bench where they ate. So again, Beis Hillel hold like the second way, that Rasavata means as long as the body is physically full, one is obligated to bench, but the best time to bench is immediately, and to give honor to the mitzvah, one should not prioritize other things. So Beis Hillel therefore held that if a person flagrantly disregards to bench in one's seat, that he should have to return no matter the effort and bench over there. But b'shoigeg, if he made a mistake, then Beis Hillel do not see a need to make any knas. They do not penalize him. He does not deserve to be put in under any imposition, and he can bench in any location that he remembers. And generally, this is the pattern that we find in the Gemara. Wherever we see that a person is obligated to do something or has to pay some sort of forfeiture, when it's b'shoigeg and b'mezid, that usually indicates some sort of gzeira, that the Chachamim are taking one measure to affect all people under all circumstances, without giving any misimpressions that there are any loopholes or any room for leniencies. But when we find that something only applies b'mezid, if a measure is only taken against someone who was willfully disobedient, then that usually indicates a knas, that kansinan only b'mezid, but not b'shoigeg, and not shoigeg got to mezid, a knas, like all the knasos that we find, whether it's Ma'aser Shabbos, whether it's Emavatinis L'Chatchila, is only over a mezid, someone who deserves, due to their own behavior, to be chastised. All right, so that explains the basis of this machloikus between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And this would also account for something that I didn't raise in the questions, but it's an obvious question itself. Beis Hillel were criticizing Beis Shammai that why are we imposing upon him to walk up flights of steps in order to bench? Well, Beis Hillel themselves should query their own motivations then as to a person who is required to return back to the table b'mezid. Why should b'mezid be any different then? And the answer to that is, according to Beis Hillel, someone who is b'mezid, someone who willfully leaves the table knowing they have to bench, deserves it. They have brought that upon themselves. And therefore, they should be punished in such a way that they should have to return back to the table and condition themselves to learn not to place other activities above the need to esteem the mitzvah of birkas hamazon. That when a mitzvah presents itself, one should fulfill the mitzvah straight away, and one should not trample the mitzvah underfoot by taking leave to do something else which they deem more important. So when it's a mezid, it's a psychological flaw as well that needs to be corrected, and that's why Beis Hillel would agree that we can impose such impositions on people who deserve it. They've brought it upon themselves. What's bothering Beis Hillel, though, is that why b'shoigeg, someone who doesn't deserve it, someone who is totally innocent, why should they have to go to the lengths? But that's because Beis Hillel see no need in having to return to the table to bench in order to fulfill the mitzvah itself. It's rather a human midas, rather a human need to give honor to the mitzvah, to give honor to Hashem.
All right, now with that in mind, let us go back to the Mishnayos and the Gomorrah and take a look at the Machloikas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel again. And while we're doing so, we'll be able to answer some of our questions. The Mishnah begins the discussion with the phrase Shachach v'lo beirach. If a person got up from the table forgetting to bench, then Beis Shammai holds he must go back to the table and bench, and Beis Hillel hold he can bench where he remembers. Beis Shammai's reason is that there is a gzeira. In order to prevent people from neglecting the mitzvah d'oraisa of benching, people need to learn to bench where they ate and not to get up from the table and get involved in other things and lose the feeling of svia, of satisfaction, like the first way of Beis Shammai. And Beis Hillel holds that he may bench where he remembers, because as long as he's physically satisfied, he can still fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. The reason the Mishnah, we can explain and answer the first question, the reason the Mishnah used this phrase shachach v'lo beirach and not shachach levarech was that the Mishnah wanted to hint to the following. If a person forgot while he was sitting down at the table and able to fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa, and he left the table and he didn't, or shachach, where he forgot while he was sitting in a position v'lo beirach, and he did not fulfill the mitzvah of benching, of bracha, midoraisa, while he was still sitting, then in his new location, Beis Shammai hold he needs to return and at least fulfill the mitzvah midorabanan, and Beis Hillel hold he can still fulfill the mitzvah even midoraisa. So that answers the first question. We now go into the exchange between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. The way we understood this exchange originally was that Beis Shammai are presenting their opinion, Beis Hillel are presenting their opinion, and they're arguing the fundamentals of each respective opinion. However, on deeper inspection, we can answer that that is not what Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing in the Brisa. Beis Shammai hold their view that there is a gzeira, there's a need to make a gzeira, that whoever didn't bench in their spot needs to return to that spot. And Beis Hillel hold there's no gzeira, only a knas for those who willingly abandon the table without benching. What they're arguing, though, in the Brisa is Beis Hillel are questioning whether such a gzeira is right to administer in a case of discomfort and in a case of great inconvenience. So Beis Hillel argue that it's all good and fine if somebody didn't bench b'mezid and they remembered when they were on the bottom floor. Well, they brought it upon themselves, as I mentioned earlier, and so they deserve to go back upstairs and to bench over there. And they've brought upon themselves all of the unnecessary stair climbing. However, Beis Hillel questioned Beis Shammai, if he made a mistake and he's innocent, is it fair to impose a gzeira in such circumstances where it's difficult? It may be too difficult for a person to keep. And Beis Shammai's response to Beis Hillel is not to defend their opinion, but to defend why it would still make sense to impose a gzeira on someone who was b'shoigeg even in circumstances like this, where it comes at great labor and great tircha to return back to the spot they ate, to bench. And Beis Shammai's argument is that if somebody left their wallet, if they left their money upstairs, and they can wait for someone to bring the money for them, if somebody's still upstairs and they'll notice the wallet and they'll bring them the wallet downstairs, would a person wait, or would a person rather go and collect the money themselves and put their own mind at ease that they've got their money in hand? A person would rather go the effort to collect their own money and to set their own mind at rest. And so, if a person is prepared to go the effort for his own comfort, for his own convenience, and to alleviate his own uh, his own anxiousness, all the more so he can do so for kavod shamayim, and it's not an imposition. And this is the kal vachomer argument that Beis Shammai are making, that it is fair to impose a gzeira, and that the gzeira should stand even for someone who was b'shoigeg, and even in a situation where the one who made the mistake is still going to have to suffer additional hassles to get to his table and bench over there, because a person going to those lengths to bench where he ate is not really an imposition. And the proof is that a person would rather go the extra mile to alleviate his own discomfort than wait for his money to come to him, wait for someone else to alleviate his discomfort. And that is the crux of the analogy that Beis Shammai are presenting to Beis Hillel here. So now we can answer the other questions. Question number 2 was, according to Beis Hillel, how does position affect the mitzvah of benching? And the answer is, Beis Hillel holds that the need to return back to the table is a knas midrabanon, in order to encourage people, or discourage people, from leaving the table before they've benched and disregarding the honor of the mitzvah by placing their own priorities first. So as a knas, someone who who deserves to be penalized, who willfully abandons the table, must return and bench there. This would answer question number 4 as well. Question number 3. That since Beis Shammai raised such a good argument, did Beis Hillel retract? Why didn't Beis Hillel retract? And the answer is because Beis Hillel are not arguing fundamentally against Beis Shammai, and Beis Shammai are not arguing fundamentally against Beis Hillel. It's not that each are trying to win the other in an argument. It's that Beis Hillel is challenging the appropriateness of gzeira that Beis Shammai are making over someone who is b'shoigeg, when they would suffer an imposition. And Beis Shammai's answer and their repudiation to Beis Hillel is that it's not an imposition, and that according to them, Beis Shammai, their gzeira over a shogeg is justified. And therefore Beis Hillel never retracted, they never argued, because they weren't there to argue for their case. They were there to challenge Beis Shammai, and the challenge was repudiated. But it does not sway the halacha of Beis Hillel in favor of Beis Shammai. This would also answer question number 4. The wording of Beis Shammai is that if a person is prepared to go to the top to retrieve his wallet, lichvoid atzmoi. Lichvoid atzmoi, in this context, would be translated as for his own purposes, for his own peace of mind. If a person has the option to wait for his money to come to him or to go and get it himself, he would rather make the extra effort and get the money himself, because it would alleviate his worry immediately. which just shows that it's not an imposition. So if a person is prepared to go lichvoid atzmoi for his own peace of mind, for literally his own honor, for his own dignity, for his own sanity, to look after himself, then all the more so to look after the needs of Shamayim, i.e., it shows that it's not an imposition. Walking all the way to the top is not really an imposition. This would also answer question number 5, in that the Kal Vachomer is a direct parallel, in that Beis Shammai are not saying that he has to go to the top floor to get his money or else he'll lose his money, because then obviously there would be no Kal Vachomer. What Beis Shammai are saying here is that a person can choose to either go and get the money himself, suffer the length of trekking up to the top floor, or he could wait until his money comes to him. So he could just as well get his money downstairs, and he could just as well bench downstairs. But because a person would rather go to the top floor to get his money straight away for his own peace of mind, it shows that walking up flights of steps is not really an imposition, and therefore we can expect him to return to the top floor for benching as well. So it's not really a kal vachomer that we need to derive that if this is the case, then all the more so that's the case, but rather it's a demonstration that if a person can wait for his money but instead chooses to go up to the top floor, which most people would do, it must mean that we, Beis Shammai, have thought this through, and we can understand that imposing a gzeira in such circumstances as to require him to go to the top floor is not really an imposition, and it is a doable gzeira. And this would also answer the question of the Sifsei Chachamim as well, that he wouldn't be losing his money here. On the contrary, he'd be getting his money back either way. It's just a question of how and when. All right, so that resolves the issues of within the sugya of the Gemara itself. We now move on to answering the rest of the questions, which is the Rishonim and the formulation of the halacha. But before we go there, let us just take a blank view of the Gemara. What messages are coming out of the Gemara that we can collate before we move on to the Rishonim? What we're seeing from the Gemara is that after Beis Shammai have repudiated themselves, and pardon me, maybe it's worth just running through all of those Gemaras again, starting with Rav Zvid, where Rav Zvid points out that Beis Hillel hold that there is a knas, b'mezid. And it's not that Beis Hillel disagree with Beis Shammai entirely. Beis Hillel do hold that there is a need for a person to return back to their seat and bench over there where they ate. However, only if they were b'mezid. And that would not be evident from the Mishnah. Maybe Beis Hillel wouldn't agree with Beis Shammai at all. Maybe there's no need for him to return at all. So Rav Zvid is telling us a chiddush that Beis Hillel do hold there is a knas, that Beis Hillel imposed on someone who leaves the table knowingly without benching. After that, we get the message that there is still a machloikas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, and a fundamental one at that. Beis Shammai hold the need to return and bench where one ate is a gzeira. Beis Hillel holds the need to return is a knas. So there is a fundamental difference between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. They are arguing all the way through. However, we do see Beis Hillel also holding now that there is a knas imposed on a mezid, someone who willfully leaves the table. The next message we get is that from the Brisa, Beis Shammai repudiated themselves, that the gzeira applies and that the gzeira is not inappropriate or unmanageable. That where a person is prepared to go the effort for themselves, they should be expected to go the effort to bench midrabanon in the place where they ate, in order to further bolster the notion that one should bench where one eats before getting up from the table. The gzera is still justified, even if it is going to cause an inconvenience. The Gemara then brings episodes where students should hold at least like Beis Shammai, and at least not disregard Beis Hillel. And then we come to the story of Rabba Bar Bachana, where even B'shoigeg, he went to great lengths to go back to his location and bench in accordance with Beis Shammai. So even before we get to the halacha, we can already see that Rabba Bar Bachana, being an Amoira and being Basroy over here, on the timeline, the latter of the opinions in the Gemara, that this Basroy, this latest opinion from the Gemara itself, insists on holding like Beis Shammai. And this is already a clue. This is already a basis for Rav Amram Goin, that the halacha itself was decided by the Amoraim to be in accordance with Beis Shammai. Now, how does Rabba Bar Bachana's opinion dovetail with the rule that the halacha follows Beis Hillel, and the rule as laid out in the Gemara here in Brachos, that the halacha follows Beis Hillel? Rabba Bar Bachana didn't dispute earlier on. No one disputed earlier on that the halacha should follow Beis Hillel. And the truth is that the halacha does follow Beis Hillel, that there is a knas that is imposed upon someone who leaves the table without benching, knowing he hasn't benched. It's just that Rabba Bar Bachana wanted to be machmir. He wanted to hold like Beis Shammai as well, because it could very well be like the first way of understanding was savarta, that if one does not bench immediately at the table, one may actually lose the mitzvah d'oraisa altogether, and one will only be able to capture the mitzvah d'rabbanon of benching by returning back to the table. And so Rabba Bar Bachana setting a precedent, not being content to hold like Beis Hillel alone, but he himself, Rabba Bar Bachana himself, was either creating or recreating or enforcing a gzera of Beis Shammai, out of the concern that Birkas Hamazon can only be recited after V'savarta, after a mental satisfaction, which is only momentarily, which can only happen after eating, immediately after eating, before leaving the table. And so now we come to Rav Amram Goin and all the Rishonim who hold like Beis Shammai, and we can understand why it is that they have wanted to adopt the gzeira of Rabba Bar Bachana, which is the gzeira of Beis Shammai. And when weighing up whether the halacha should follow Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai, the Rishonim hold the halacha to be like Beis Hillel, but they want to adopt the chumrah and the gzeira of Rabba Bar Bachana and of Beis Shammai as well. And this is something which is permitted, and we have a tshuva from the Ramah, which has been provided in the source lists over here. If you want to take a look at that tshuva inside, that although the halacha follows Beis Hillel, if one wants to, one may be machmir according to Beis Shammai if it's not going to undermine anything, or if it's not going to undermine Beis Hillel, or if it's not going to undermine any other areas of halacha. It's not a chumrah d'asili kula. It's not a chumrah where in some circumstances will be more work out as being more strict, but in other circumstances may even prove to be a leniency. It has to be uniform and a consistent chumrah all the time. You can go see examples of that there in the tshuva. And this is the same case. If one wants to, one can be machmir, and because Rabba Bar Bachana did take Beis Shammai and the gzeira of Beis Shammai seriously, he held like Beis Shammai. So in doing so, he set a precedent that all the other chachamim and all the other generations would adopt the chumrah of Beis Shammai as well. And with that we can understand the Tosfos, who say that although the halacha follows Beis Hillel, when there is a pure machloikus, when there is middle ground where Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree, then one can follow Beis Shammai. And maybe one even should follow Beis Shammai. What that means is that over here, because Beis Hillel do hold of a knas, there's a need to return back to bench where you ate. And they do agree with Beis Shammai, not in terms of the mechanism, because it's a knas, it's not a gzeira. But Beis Shammai let's say, on top of adding another layer to Beis Hillel, then one can paskin like Beis Shammai. Meaning to say, Beis Hillel holds that if you are mazid, if you leave the table b'mazid, you should return to bench at the table. And Beis Shammai are saying on top of that, not only b'mazid, but even b'shoigeg, and for good reason. And that's what Tosfos meant. Not that there's a point where Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai agree and therefore you can choose either side you wish. But because Beis Shammai agree with Beis Hillel, they just add another level onto Beis Hillel, and for different reasons. So in that situation, one can and one should be machmir, like Beis Shammai. But it could very well be that the tipping point here has been Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, who has demonstrated that he wants to sustain this gzeira of Beis Shammai, and that he set a precedent for others to follow, and others did follow. And so that would answer question number 6, that where do we see that we can disregard the rule halacha Beis Hillel, and also disregard the Gemara that says quite openly that the halacha follows Beis Hillel? And the answer is that indeed the halacha does follow Beis Hillel, up to that opinion who voiced it in the Gemara Brachos. Rabbi Bar Bar Chana agrees the halacha also follows Beis Hillel, but Rabbi Bar Bar Chana added another gzeira on top of Beis Hillel, which was the original gzeira of Beis Shammai. He wanted to enforce it, or reinforce it, or reinstate that gzeira, and set a precedent that others should follow. And that's why Rav Amram Goin picked up on Rabbi Bar Bar Chana and followed it through with all the other Rishonim. Now let's come to the Tur. Question number 7 was, how does leaving the table b'mazid impede the actual mitzvah birkas hamazon? If one leaves the table and one doesn't bench where one ate, then the Tur holds one's not even yoytze the mitzvah birkas hamazon. So based on what we've said, we can understand the Tur as follows. The way the Tur understood Beis Shammai was that there was a gzeira made over shoigeg and another gzeira made over mazid, meaning Beis Shammai holds that the mitzvah of a savaita is like the first way. When one is sitting at the table and one is feeling mental satisfaction, only then can one bench and fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. But as soon as one leaves the table and one forgets about that sensation, then one can no longer fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa. One can maybe fulfill the mitzvah midrabanan, which is the case, and one has to return back to the table to fulfill that mitzvah midrabanan where one ate. But either way, whatever one's intentions are when leaving the table, as soon as one gets up, one is no longer fulfilling the mitzvah midoraisa anymore. Now, with that in mind, that from this point onwards, after leaving the table, a person can at most fulfill birkas hamazon only midorabanan. The gzeira is that if a person forgets, then let him fulfill his mitzvah midorabanan at the table, and hopefully that will teach him and inculcate within him and others the need to bench at the table before leaving. And that was where the gzeira would really have its impact on a shoigeg, on someone who is not paying attention when they leave the table. However, for a mazid, for someone who knows they need to bench and has willfully disregarded the mitzvah midoraisa, there, Beis Shammai held of another gzeira, that such people need to suffer something else in order to train them to stay at the table and not disregard and not brazenly disregard the mitzvahs aseh deraisa. And that is that if they do not return to the table and bench there, then their mitzvah of benching midorabanan won't even count either. They've not fulfilled the mitzvah. They've lost the mitzvah deraisa and they've lost the mitzvah derabanan as well. And this is also part of the gzeira, that the Chachamim wanted to train people to make do birkas hamazon before leaving the table and fulfill the mitzvah daraisa. And for someone who is stubborn and someone who is flagrantly disregarding the Chachamim, having a gzeira to merely return to the table is not enough, because if they bench elsewhere and they feel that they can get away with it, then they're not going to ever be in a position where they will bench and fulfill the mitzvah daraisa. So as a safeguard, Beis Shammai held that if they bench b'mezid in another location, then they haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of benching midrabanan either. They have to return back to where they were and bench again in their location of where they ate, and that will instill within them the import of having to bench before leaving the table. And with that, we can understand the explanation of the Beis Yosef. That was the Beis Yosef's way of understanding the Tur, that if Beis Shammai were strict over someone who was b'shoigeg, and they had measures to ensure that someone who forgot to bench will pay better attention next time, then all the more so when it comes to mazid, someone who is aware that they are disregarding the mitzvah d'oraisa, what are Beis Shammai going to do in order to train up such a person like that with such a mindset to bench at the table before they leave? And that is, they added another point to the gzeira, which is if they bench b'mezid elsewhere, then they're not even yotzi birkas hamazon derabanan. They have to return back to the table and bench again. So that would answer the Taz's problems with the Beis Yosef, and that's the Beis Yosef's understanding of the logical progression of the Tur's understanding of Beis Shammai. So to answer question number 7, how does change of location impede the mitzvah, which seems to be standalone? The answer is that the mitzvah at this point is no longer standalone because it's no longer doraisa. A person who leaves the table has lost that mitzvah doraisa. All they can do is fulfill a mitzvah derabanan of benching, and the rabbanon, hem amru vehem amru, hem gozru vehem gozru, the chachamim have the ability to decide when a person can fulfill their mitzvah and when not. And the Chachamim decided that if the person benches b'mezid in another location, that they are not fulfilling their mitzvah derabanan, and the Chachamim can abrogate the mitzvah since it is their mitzvah to stipulate over. And that is the mechanism by where benching in another location can actually impede
the fulfillment of a mitzvah derabanan. So again, because the Chachamim can set the terms by which one can fulfill one of their mitzvahs, if they hold that benching in another location does not fulfill their mitzvah, then so be it. Then the person would have to bench again. So this is where the mechanism by which the Beis Yosef understood the progression of the gzeira. At the same time, we can answer for the Taz as well, because if we look at this incident of Rabba Baba Chana, when we delve into this incident, we can ask the following question. Rabba Baba Chana was in a predicament where it was highly unlikely that the caravan was going to stop in the middle of nowhere and wait for him to go back to bench, or even wait for him to go back to retrieve something. So Rabbi Bar Bar Chana could have just dispensed with it there and then. He could have benched, relying on the fact that, or on the assumption that the caravan wouldn't really wait for him. But yet, that wasn't enough for Rabbi Bar Bar Chana. And he had to test to see if the situation was in his control, where it was possible to get back to where he ate, or whether the situation was indeed out of his control, and that he would not risk being stranded in the middle of nowhere without company. But because if the situation was in his control and he refused to go back to where he ate, then he would be mazed and he would miss the mitzvah d'Rabbanan of benching as well. And it was for this reason that Rabbi Bar Bar Chana tested the waters by asking the company whether they could wait for him to go back and retrieve his lost item. Not only that, but Rabbi Bar Bar Chana also had to distort the truth. So why would he go to such lengths if not to be able to salvage the mitzvah d'Rabbanan, or to be able to prove to himself that he was indeed an oines and it was out of his control to get back, or whether it was in his control and he was obligated to to return. So instead of making assumptions, which he could have easily, Rabbi Bar Bar Chana felt compelled in order to test to see if the situation was in his control to get back to where he was. And why would he have gone to all of these lengths? It wasn't just because he was machmir, just to satisfy Beis Shammai. It must be because b'mezid, at any point that he was b'mezid, he wouldn't have fulfilled the mitzvah of birkas hamazon. Now we move to question that's answered question number 8. We move to question number 9. Why is the mechaber undecided whether the halacha follows Beis Shammai or Beis Hillel? This isn't a mere safek in the din. It's not that the mechaber never reached a conclusion. The mechaber always weighs up the opinions, and he always looks at the rishonim, and he always comes out with some final halacha. It's just that what we have here is a situation that doesn't occur very often, and that is where the halacha follows Beis Hillel, and that is the halacha as the Gemara has pointed out. But on the other hand, we have Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, who has maintained and upheld and maybe even reinstituted the gzeira of Beis Shammai and set a precedent for others to follow. And so, where we're faced with halacha versus a possible gzeira or possible chumrah, it's hard to tell. And for that reason, the mechaber leaves the matter undecided, because he's presenting us with both sides, the halacha, but also the reinstated gzeira. It appears that the mechaber holds like the gzeira, like most of the rishonim do, and therefore, if b'shoyeg, one would have to return back to where one ate. And this would answer question number 10 as well, based on the incident of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, and also based on the exchange between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, where Beis Shammai expect a person to go back up to the top floor and bench over there, precisely because they would have done so for their own needs. We're able to now craft an idea of what Shas Hadchak is. Based on the incident of Rabbi Bar Bar Chana, where he had to test to see if it was in his control or not. And from there we can see that if the situation is indeed out of one's control, if one cannot get back to where one ate, if one has covered too much distance, or if there is any other inhibition that inhibits one from getting back to where one ate, and those situations are beyond one's control, one can't do anything about it, one can't reverse it, so one can bench where one remembers. Also, from Beis Shammai, we see that if a person is not prepared to go back to where they were originally to retrieve their money because of an imposition or because of a financial loss, then that is also a shas adchak, a situation where they're not expected to return to bench either. All right, so with that in mind, we can now come to the final principles. And let us go through those 4 scenarios again. The lechatchila sheba-lechatchila, the lechatchila sheba-b'diavad, b'diavad sheba-b'diavad, and the shas adchak. But now we're able to fill in the reasons and the principles behind them. The first level, lechatchila sheba-lechatchila. When one is finished eating and one is no longer satisfied physically, mentally, one should bench, one should recite birkas hamazon and fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa according to all opinions. Second level, lechatchila sheba-b'diavad. If one left the table and then one remembered that one hadn't benched yet, then according to Beis Shammai, one has lost the mitzvah d'oraisa, but one can still retrieve the mitzvah d'Rabbanan, and one is indeed obligated. There's a gzeira that the Chachamim made that he must return back to the table and recite birkas hamazon there. And that is the way that all of the poskim hold. And for sure, b'mezid, if a person leaves the table knowing they haven't benched, that they must return back to where they ate. According to Beis Hillel, as long as one is satisfied physically, one can still fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa, and therefore b'diavad, one can rely on Beis Hillel that one is still able to do the mitzvah. B'diavad sheba-b'diavad. If one left the table and one benched in another location, then if it was b'shoigeg, if he benched somewhere else after realizing that he hadn't benched in his original location, b'diavad, he's yotzi. According to Beis Shammai, he's yotzi midrabanan because it was a mistake. According to Beis Hillel, he's yotzi as well. Now, if it was b'mezid, if he left the table knowing that he hadn't benched, and then he benched in another location, b'diavad sheba-b'diavad, then he need not bench again. Although the Tur holds he would have to go back to his spot at the table and bench, nonetheless, all of the poskim come out sofek brachas lahakel, that he need not bench again. And then we have the 4th scenario, which is the shas adchak, that where it's not in his control to return back to the table, and if he left the table for shoigeg and then he realized that he hadn't benched, and it's impossible for him to return back to the table, then according to everyone he can bench where he is. Beis Shammai will hold that he'll retrieve the mitzvah midrabanan. Beis Hillel will hold he will retrieve the mitzvah d'oraisa. And we see that in the case of shas adchak, where he would not be able to return, or it would be an imposition that he wouldn't even return for his own personal use. So Beis Shammai and Rabbi Bar Chana would agree that he need not return. If, however, he left the table b'mezid, knowing he hadn't benched, and now he finds himself in a predicament where he cannot return to the table to bench, then according to the Taz, he can bench where he is. According to the Alter Rebbe in the Mishnah Berurah, he has to return back to the table. Now, practically, if he cannot return back to the location where he ate, and we're weighing up whether it's better that he bench where he is, or he not bench at all, because Mishnah Berurah and Alter Rebbe hold that he has to go back to where he was. Here, we can hold like the Taz, and it also makes sense because at the end of the day, since he cannot return back to where he ate, since nobody holds like the Tur, he must at least, according to Beis Hillel, fulfill the mitzvah d'oraisa and not give that up because he cannot go back to eat where he was. All right, so that ends our analysis, and that ends our first sugya on benching where one ate. And just before we conclude, let's address a point that has been dealt with by a corollary over here that is dealt with by the modern poskim, but that becomes moot after we've just after our analysis. And that is, if one is eating a meal in an aeroplane or on a train, and between eating and finishing one's meal and benching, one has covered some distance, that type of change is purely incidental. The ground that moves underneath the plane, under the aeroplane, is really immaterial, because the person has eaten and is now benching in the same location that he ate. He hasn't gotten up from the table, so he's still experiencing physical satisfaction. He's still experiencing mental satisfaction finishing his meal where he is on the plane. So the fact that the ground moves beneath him is irrelevant. For benching, as we've discussed, we need vasavata, and someone who's sitting in the original seat enjoying their meal is experiencing vasavata and can fulfill the mitzvah doraisa. So with that, we conclude our first sugya on the need to recite Birkas Hamazon at the table, at the place that one ate, according to Beis Shammai midoraisa, according to Beis Hillel midorabanan. And if one left the table without benching, then according to Beis Shammai there is a gzeira that he return, and according to Beis Hillel there's a knas for a mazid that does not want to return.